On this day, 16th of February 1940, the Altmark Incident takes place within Norwegian waters. This is during the Phoney War, just before the German invasion of Denmark and Norway. Hitler and his government are going to use this incident to justify their invasion and occupation of those two countries. The Battle of the River Plate, Rio de la Plata, the estuary that forms the boundary between Uruguay and Argentina, had taken place on the 13th of December 1939. This had been as a result of the Graf Spee, which had been put out to sea just before the war and sent to the South Atlantic to intercept ships on various trade routes from Latin America to Britain. A lot of foodstuffs were going between Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Britain itself. The Graf Spee was actually named after a German who had died in the Battle of the Falklands in the First World War. So it's kind of fitting that the ship named after him was cornered and scuttled in the same part of the world as its namesake. Anyway, during this battle, about 300 British naval troops had been captured and had become prisoners aboard other German ships. One of them was the Altmark, and it was from this ship that the incident would get its name. The Altmark, on its way back to Germany with its 300 British prisoners, passed through Norwegian waters, as they needed to because they couldn't pass through the English Channel or too near to the British coast. And because the North Sea had been mined from Scottish mainland up to the Orkneys and then up to the Shetlands and then out almost to Norwegian waters themselves, the only way to safely get back to Germany was through Norwegian waters. The British had requested that the Norwegians inspect the ship as it passed through its waters. It wasn't illegal to go through neutral waters, but they did get on the ship 3 times. They did do a cursory inspection, but didn't go down into the hold where the prisoners were being kept. And after the third inspection, British finally did sight the Altmark in Norwegian waters. Now, this was going to be dangerous. Under international law, they are not allowed to intercept any vessels in a neutral's waters. But they knew that they had British prisoners on board, which was in breach of international law, but they would have to breach international law to write international law. What is to be done? After the Altmark had been spotted by British aircraft, the Royal Navy was told about this, and the Altmark was then intercepted by the HMS Cossack, which is a destroyer. Altmark then sought refuge in the Jøsing Fjord, and the Cossack followed her in the next day. The Norwegian naval escorts that had been following the Altmark blocked initial attempts to board the ship. British then sent away for instructions from the Admiralty, and Winston Churchill, who was the First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, he wasn't Prime Minister just yet, said, unless Norwegian torpedo boats undertakes to convoy Altmark to Bergen with a joint Anglo-Norwegian guard on board and a joint escort, you should board Altmark, Liberate the prisoners and take possession of the ship pending further instructions. If Norwegian torpedo boat interferes, you should warn her to stand off. If she fires upon you, you should not reply unless attack is serious, in which case you should defend yourself, using no more force than is necessary, ceasing fire when she desists. Suggest to Norwegian destroyer the honor is served by submitting to superior force. So, once the Norwegians had refused to join the British to jointly bring the German ship Altmark to Bergen, the Royal Navy decided to engage. The Norwegians were standing to the side. They were not very impressed, but they couldn't really do much. The German crew on the Altmark, they went aground. They pushed the ship aground, and the British then boarded about 10 o'clock on the 16th of February. After some hand-to-hand fighting, they took over the ship and went into the hold. And they shouted down into the hold, "Are there any Englishmen here?" And the prisoners shouted back, "Yes, we're British." And there was lots of cheering, and it was all very patriotic and very good. And this was used, obviously, for propaganda purposes. However, the problem here, which seems like a very small thing considering you're at war, that the British did breach international laws here, whilst the Germans kind of technically did, but didn't. They were allowed to take prisoners through neutral waters, but only if they said that they were taking prisoners. They denied they were taking prisoners, and the Norwegians never looked hard enough. So for the Norwegians, the Germans were fine. The Brits knew that they had British prisoners on board, so they knew that they were a big target for them. And so they shouldn't really have been going into Norwegian waters and demanding the Norwegians hand over a ship of a third nation to them. But they did. And there was about 7 German sailors were killed. And if there had been a Nuremberg trials, if the Germans had won, this probably would have been something up there, the Germans to accuse the British of. However, good thing they didn't lose, and this is now a big triumph, especially during this time. The phony war, wasn't really much going on. The border between France and Germany was quiet. Nothing was really happening. Poland had been crushed. And really the only thing that was happening was the Blockade of Germany, which eventually, long term, the blockade was probably one of the most important things in bringing Germany down. Because without the international trade, without the imports and exports, Germany was pretty screwed. And it wasn't obvious maybe at this point, but by the next year, they were so desperate, they decided to go for the Soviet Union, and they decided to attack towards the Baku oil fields. They needed that, because without oil, they would have lost a lot earlier. I've heard that the Second World War was the first oil war. And being strangled of oil by the British blockade is what eventually brought them down. Doesn't sound sexy, doesn't sound heroic, but blockades work. Anyway, getting back to this, we're going to have to see the impact that this had on the war. the incident of the British going into Norwegian waters and seizing a German ship, killing German soldiers on neutral soil, and then taking 300 prisoners of war back, was a great propaganda victory for the British. 4-year war is ongoing, and it seemed to many that there was a lack of will amongst the French and the British to actually take the war to Germany. So something like this showed that something could happen. The Norwegians were furious. Their neutrality had been infringed. They were trying to stay out of this war. They had successfully stayed out of the First World War, even though back then they were still worried that there might be some sort of action by one or the other. They'd remain neutral. They wanted to do that again. This was not helping their cause. In Germany, Hitler and his government were looking at this and thinking about whose side Norway was really on. Hitler had already decided to invade Norway well over 2 months before this incident. 14th of December, the plan had been authorized. And after this, it was decided that on the 19th of February, that attacks would be take place on Norway and Denmark as quickly as possible. This eventually happened on the 9th of April, and in one day, Denmark would surrender rather than turn themselves into a battle zone. And on that same day, some of the main ports in Norway would be taken. It was, in many ways, a disaster for Norway. In some ways, it was a disaster for Germany. But in the medium term, it ended up being very handy. So when they did invade Norway, they could say, well, look at these horrible Brits. They're violating Norwegian neutrality, and we're here to stop those horrible Brits from using Norway as a springboard to invade or attack Germany. For the British, initially this was quite good. Medium term, not so good. Long term, it ended up being quite good, because the assistance that the British gave the Norwegians during the war, at the beginning when it was being invaded, during when it was being occupied, and afterwards, ended up solidifying a friendly relationship between the two countries. So much so that every year Norway sends a Christmas tree to London, where it's put up in Trafalgar Square. So that's the story of the Altmark Incident. If you like these videos, come back for more tomorrow. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment.